Good morning, everyone. Hello. Great. I'm sure you had your coffee, and those of you who have nicotine fix, you've done well. Um, Thank you, Elena. We've been talking about this, part of our collaboration, getting together. It's been a while, but I'm so happy that I'm here. Anna, thank you for your wonderful introduction. And Elena, to your wonderful partners, C and the City Museum, C, SCA. And now, in the 20 minutes that I've got, check your watches, I'm going to focus on four things. Who am I? What is it that I do? And why is it that I do what I do? And what do I stand for? For I've been brought up in the Gandhian tradition by my grandparents. And Mahatma Gandhi used to say, to believe in something and not practice it is a crime. And so I get my fingers in the dirt half the year and actually work with communities. Right now, mostly in Afghanistan. Now I have a question, questions for you. How many of you been to India? Put your hands up. How many of you been to Australia? Wow. How many of you been to South Africa? How many of you been to Vietnam? How many of you been to Denmark? Oh, no. The reason I ask is my last 33 years. I'm a storyteller, but I'll stick to the time. My last 33 years has been a very long journey. But I was actually born, brought up, educated in India. I did not live in a city till I was 20 years old. And yet I managed to conceive, design, concept design, and oversee the construction of the city museum called Canberra Museum and Gallery in the capital of Australia. I also collaborated with Max Hebditch from the City Museum, Museum of London, in establishing the International Forum for City Museums, which has now become a committee of ICOM called CAMAC. And, but exhibitions have always been very challenging for me because right from the beginning, I did not see myself in them. Either as a migrant or somebody coming from a low socioeconomic background in India. And so my whole life's journey is about the first voice, in the wonderful institutions, civic space, and to make them into civic spaces, what we call museums. That's been my journey. So 25 years in India, born, brought up, educated at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is when I went to a city in New Delhi. And then the Australians found me because I was excavating human remains of my own ancestors long before it was a topic of conversation in museums. And they said, how the hell are you doing it? Come here, mate, come to Australia. So I go to Australia. Those days we thought of Australians as sheep farmers and wheat farmers who played good cricket and tennis. I mean, that was a stereotype in India in the 70s. So I worked there establishing the National Affirmative Action Program for the participation of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders in museums, galleries, libraries, archives, national parks, and World Heritage areas. It sounds very sexy, but it was a really tough job because I went there on the tail end of the demise of White Australia policy. And the Aboriginal people to this day have very little voice, if at all, in the political system of Australia. And but based on that work, I was told that, hey, what you're doing in Australia is pilot work for the real stuff here in South Africa. And so I worked for 5 years as an advisor and transformation planner in South Africa, transforming apartheid institutions to democratic institutions under the first president of South Africa. And I was initially funded by the Swedish Arts Council and through Winnie Mandela, who was then the Deputy Minister for Arts and Culture. And the 5 years I spent in Vietnam, they're largely supported by SIDA, Swedish International Development Agency, starting off with using ecomuseology as a tool for dealing with HIV/AIDS and Hep B, and finishing off with training of women museum directors who rarely get opportunities to go overseas, because when there are opportunities overseas, it's always men who put their hand up, they go. So when I questioned them in a Ford Foundation workshop and a CEDA workshop, the men said, oh, but women who look after the children and everybody else, they've got to stay home and look after the museums. So I actually turned this around in establishing a national network of women directors, museum directors in Vietnam, and created a range of opportunities, including the establishment of, or redesign of the Women's Museum in Hanoi and the Women's Museum in Ho Chi Minh City. And spent quite a bit of time in the Netherlands, and that's where my story begins as to why I also have moved to Denmark. If I stay long enough, that's 9 years, I'll become a citizen, because that's how long you got to stay as a permanent resident before you can become a citizen, unlike in Australia, which is much shorter. And then you wouldn't be able to get rid of me because I'm too old. So the Nordics will have to put up with me. So that's my journey in one sense. And but when I was working as an advisor in the Netherlands, in Leiden at the Volkenkunde National Museum of Ethnology. And I was running a masterclass for PhD students, 18 of them from 10 countries. They bring their chapters, and we were using different museums, to deal with the whole question of community engagement and inclusion, from assimilation to real integration through the first voice of migrants, rather than, the establishment trying to reposition itself. So one morning outside the Kinder Museum, we had a workshop in the Tropen Museum. Outside the Kinder Museum, during morning coffee break, you come out for fresh air, and you see a white cloth and a body underneath. And that was Theo van Gogh. He was assassinated that morning. And but the Dutch society reacted in an amazing way, from being extremely generous in funding anything to do with multiculturalism in the cultural sector. They swung right to the other end, and almost anti-multiculturalism. Of course, the pendulum has swung back again. And there was a lot of violence, as some of you know. So we had a forum at the Tropen Museum. Baroness Lola Young, then, she's from the House of Lords, and if you think she's like Maggie Thatcher, I can tell you she's not. She's as black as one would be, as red a lipstick as you can get, and as thick, leather boots. And comes onto the stage and saying, "What the fuck are you doing? You're trying to show me you're early, for this meeting." I was on time, and she doesn't mind using the word F. And can you imagine that in the House of Lords in the UK? And she used to sit always opposite Maggie Thatcher, just to make a point. But that's when I founded the Inclusive Museum Network and Knowledge Community. Why did I do it? I just found for too long, those of us trying to say, we don't want to be multicultural, we don't want to be at the margins. We want to be at the center. We want to be part of the whole. We want a holistic approach. We believe in integration. We didn't want to self-marginalize ourselves at the margins, but our voices were always co-opted. You have the same academic, you have the same museum director. They come to one conference, they listen to you. They come to second conference, they listen to you. Third conference, they're actually presenting a paper on multiculturalism without actually doing anything practical, synthesizing the works of people who are struggling in this area and publishing books or commissioning exhibitions from the dominant point of view. And but what happened in Netherlands, and at this conference at the Tropen Museum called Dancing with Diversity, where Baroness Lola Young and I kick-started the discussion, we first said, look, none of us are, Indian or black. By deciding to migrate to Denmark, I've already started a journey, And if you want to do an exhibition about me as an Indian, then you're missing the whole point because you are practicing essentialism. Most academics, most museums practice essentialism by saying that, oh, this is Indian, this is Pakistani, this is Yemeni, or this is Sudanese. All of us are, just like none of the women here are wearing coattails, none of the men are wearing, men are wearing coattails, women are wearing corsets. Why do you freeze us? Why do you freeze other people in time? That's a cultural violation. That's a human right violation. To freeze other people, to contain is to define. And don't imprison people. But if you really believe in integration, then it's all of us together. So this is the principle. And when I founded it, the first conference, it's a knowledge community, it's a research community. We met in Leiden. We deliberately met in Netherlands because of what happened in Netherlands. And, but we started off the whole Inclusive Museum knowledge community. The web page is in your abstract, page 24, 25. And is based on 2 video clips. One video clip, one personal experience when I was in South Africa. Number 1, when Nelson Mandela was committed for treason with the Reviona trials in 1964, he said, there's room for all South Africans. There's room for all South Africans in South Africa. On the 10th of May, 1994, when he was inaugurated as the president of Democratic South Africa, thundering at the Union Square in Pretoria, he finished off by saying, let there be land, let there be water, and let there be salt for all people of South Africa. So he never actually, desegregated people into essentialist categories. And on one occasion, in one meeting, he got a bit, he questioned us by saying, why do you avoid the word multiculturalism? In the past, it was used to keep people apart. Now we must use it to bring people together. There's nothing wrong with multiculturalism. I mean, that was Mandela's quote, unquote. And so how do we bring people together? So the Inclusive Museum Knowledge Community is not about immigrants. It's not about any particular group, but it's about all of us. But how do we deal with this? It's not easy because the gatekeepers are always people who are in control of the institution or the academy. And very rarely do you find somebody of my color or ethnicity in those categories. It's usually the establishment, as in Pierre Bourdieu's words, it's a whole cultural reproduction that's taking place. And our voices are being co-opted rather than being joining in collaboration, Elena, as she puts it, together, that we all work together to build a better future for tomorrow. I'm coming back to Stockholm after 10 years. I used to come here a lot. I was very well looked after. Had to work very hard with the World Commission for Culture and Development and the Stockholm Action Plan. And the last time I was here was for Stockholm Action Plan +5. And right now, I'm coming straight from Bali in Indonesia, where the president of Indonesia has convened a major meeting with leaders from all over the world, and to look at sustainable development goals and how they inform post-2015 development agenda. Most of you would know Millennium Development Goals have not really delivered. Ban Ki-moon at Rio+20 last year said more of the same will not do. So the Inclusive Museum community, in Bali, we just adopted the Bali Promise. The idea is that the dialogue should no longer be north, 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 south, and then south is added. It's south, 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 north, but it's for all of us. That's what the Bali Promise is about in the post-2015 development agenda. And but the thing is that in all of this, it's about all of us. So how do you do it when you got gatekeepers? So what we did, thanks to Common Ground Publishing and its founder, Professor Bill Cope, and also Professor Mary Kalantzis, they actually used digital technologies to create interactivity, because most of us use about 5% of the technologies available at the front end, but the rest is at the back end. So what we established, by the way, it's really a big compliment that a lot of conference companies have copied what we are trying to do, only front end, but unfortunately they didn't understand the 95% back end of technologies. And the back end of technologies is, how do we go beyond gatekeepers? So there are no gatekeepers. I mean, we have an advisory committee that's only to advise, not to control. So the back end of technology is anybody in the world who is dealing with inclusion in museums and cultural heritage and researching on it based on the criteria that's on the web page and the scoping that's been done by International Council of Museums across the world. And I chaired the process for that criteria. They can upload an abstract and their CV. But we can tell if somebody is rehashing, presenting the same thing. The technology helps us. Then they find, based on the keywords, the technology finds the peers. I don't do it. I'm the chair of the community. But the technology finds the peers, flicks across evaluation forms. And if you make it, then you get to present in the annual research conference. Next one is at the Geonautry in Los Angeles. This year we was in Copenhagen at the SMK. And then you publish with the knowledge community. So that means what we've got is, we've got a very large number of people participating in this from 167 countries. But what we've got is we've got a whole lot of new people. And the majority of them are young people below the age of 30. Remember, your professor allows you to present a paper. Here you self-determine, which is the paradigm shift here. And second thing is, the majority of participants are women in this, because they're the ones dealing with change. And so we created this inclusive knowledge community, which is entirely peer-driven, but using interactive technologies, which is one of the reasons that Alena wanted me to come here and present, and I really appreciate it. And so this community, now if you, for example, if you look at page 24, I put in an image from my recent work in Afghanistan. It's a copper axe head. It's a copper axe head from the 3rd millennium BC, from Afghanistan, from Kandahar. And what you see on the axe head is actually a snake trying to devour a lion. And, well, in a simple anthropological sense, there's the Naga cults before, they were converted to other faiths. And but this is a conflict between two tribes with two different totems, the Nagas and the lion, because there used to be lions there. Even when Alexander the Macedonian went through there were plenty of lions, but they all, they disappeared in a short period of time. And but typically in the museum, you give your minimal caption: bronze axe head, 3rd millennium BC, Kandahar. And then in the next level of interpretation, if you're lucky, you get that the whole, the kind of fetish-sized approach that anthropology has introduced into museums. But how do we, in the digital domain, bring in the multiple voices of people? Because the Naga cults continued in quite a few parts of Afghanistan, including what was called Kafirstan, and then when they were converted to Islam, it's called Nuristan. Nur means light, the land of light. And the Naga cults are still practiced over there. And so there's a continuity of people. How do we reconnect our collections with communities? So the triangulation of connectivity, through digitization. The Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago is digitizing the entire collections of the National Museum of Afghanistan in Kabul. So this collection is also being digitized. We ran a workshop on the consequences of digitization. Already you have not the first voice of the people, but what you have is the voice of the museum, the archaeologist, the anthropologist, and now you digitize, there'll be multiple other voices, but really, how do we bring the layers of significance and multiple voices and the multivocality of what we see as significant? How do we bring that into an inclusive framework without creating a hierarchy that one is superior to the other? And how do we do this? And so that's one of the challenges that I deal with in the inclusive museum knowledge community. When I say I am many peoples. And I'm no single person. And there's a whole range of teams that work together. And I hope that makes sense, that inclusion is, when your government talks about integration in Sweden, or the governments in the region, some of us, when Angela Merkel and David Cameron last year, they said, oh, state-sponsored multiculturalism has not worked. We should get rid of it. For heaven's sake, we've been saying it for 30 years. Did you ever listen to us? State-sponsored settlement services is different from state-sponsored multiculturalism. What they've been talking about, what they've been doing is state-sponsored settlement services, not multiculturalism. If it is multiculturalism, then in Mandela's voice, it's about bringing all of us together. Am I right? So it should be that way. And so it's nothing new. So they've finally woken up, the politicians. And so how do we deal with this kind of notion of integration? But the most important thing is to listen to the young people. We pay lip service to sustainable development, but we forget the next generation. Sustainability is about posterity, the next generation. So how do we deal with this? How do we get away from the tyranny of academic imperialism, where the academy has controlled what we do for too long? How do we actually diversify the academy so there's multiple voices in the academy rather than a token black or a token woman or a token Indian? And how do we do that? And it's the same in museums. We co-opt people. We bring artists to do exhibitions in our museums. You take Fred Wilson mining the museum, Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. I was with him because at that stage I had a project with the Studio Museum in Harlem, and he comes from New York. So before the opening, he and Naomi Nelson from the Studio Museum in Harlem, we were there. And recently I was having breakfast with Elaine Gurian, a very famous museologist, not only American, but international. We said, what impact did Fred Wilson's mining the museum have on the institution? It's a phenomenal project. But what happened afterwards? Has anything changed in that museum to make it inclusive, to diversify it? So the question is, we should keep asking, why is it what we are doing, and what consequences? And we got to have a certain amount of integrity and honesty. In a sense, be Gandhian, be a Mandela in your own sense. I'm a practicing Buddhist, and all of us are potential Buddhas. All of us are potential. So similarly, you're all potential Gandhis, you're all potential Mandelas, but the most important thing is to be honest to ourselves as to why we are doing what we're doing, and not co-opt other voices and represent others and deny the basic human rights of human beings to express themselves. And finally, and given I've got 2 minutes, 20 seconds, and in the abstract, you find some links. For 6 years, I chaired an international cross-cultural task force with International Council of Museums in Paris. Inclusive Museum Knowledge Community has come out of it. But in Shanghai in 2010, at the ICOM General Conference, we adopted the ICOM Cultural Diversity Charter. In August this year, the ICOM Triennial General Conference, the question came up, what consequences ICOM Cultural Diversity Charter? I can bet my bottom dollar that the majority of academics and museum people haven't actually read it. Principle 10 talks about the digital domain. And also, Rio basically said in the next 3 years, there needs to be an evaluation. We need to self-evaluate. Are we really dealing with cultural diversity? There are 10 principles that are axiomatic, non-negotiable, that you can use to benchmark your own transformation, your own performance. No point in rhetoric, but actually benchmark your own transformation performance. Digital domain, that principle number 10, talks about 3 things. It talks about digital access, which is what a lot of us talk about, digitization and interaction, which we talk about, but we rarely talk about digital heritage, that heritage that's born digital. Because we don't no longer operate in an analog world. But what consequences? Because the principle has to be read in conjunction with the ICOM Code of Ethics. So you might digitize, but are you actually engaging with the source communities? Many museums digitize secret and sacred objects in Europe coming from source communities where it's restricted for people to view them. But there's no consultation. It's a common practice. So I'm just giving you one example. So how do we actually promote ethical practice in the digital domain? So how do we practice cultural democracy in the digital domain was my main question in the abstract. Because Europe has been excellent in dealing with cultural democracy. How do you actually, practice this in the digital domain? And so in many ways, the transformation of, things in the digital domain might be very sexy, flash, but that which is sexy and flash is not necessarily inclusive. It doesn't necessarily respect cultural rights and human rights, doesn't necessarily bring integration into our culturally and linguistically diverse communities. How do we deal with this? So these are some of the questions I want to leave you with. But I want to finish up by saying that I'm not trying to point a finger at someone and, wait a minute. All of you, point a finger at me. Point a finger at me. Come on. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Do it, do it. I come from a community where pointing a finger is quite dangerous. But I don't mind. I have let go as a Buddhist, so that's fine. Okay, point a finger. Now, how many fingers are facing you? 3, right? Mahatma Gandhi used to say, when you point a finger at someone, there's 1, 2, 3 fingers facing you. What have you done? So each one of us is responsible to promote inclusion in the digital domain. Thank you.